Welcome to my channel of Gill Master Stories. Don't forget to subscribe button and press on the bell icon for more inspiration and mind-blowing stories. A simple note left at a diner table transforms the life of a struggling single mom and sets off a chain of events no one could have imagined. The neon sign flickered outside the diner, a stubborn light refusing to go out completely, much like the man who now pushed open the glass door. His shoulders sagged from the weight of the day, the kind of weariness that sank deep into your bones. He was no stranger to long hours. The steel plant had been running overtime for weeks, and he had grown accustomed to the grind. But tonight he wasn't heading straight home to collapse on the couch. Tonight he craved a quiet corner, a warm plate, and a chance to breathe. Inside the diner hummed with soft chatter and the clinking of utensils. The air smelled of fried food and coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long. He slid into a booth near the window, where he could see the rain beginning to streak the glass. It wasn't cozy, but it was a break, a moment away from the relentless pace outside. It wasn't until she approached the table that he noticed her. The waitress couldn't have been much older than 22, though. Her tired eyes and slumped posture made her seem older. A few strands of blonde hair had escaped the ponytail she had hastily tied, and her uniform bore the stains of too many rushes. "And too little care." "Hi," she said, her voice barely audible. She fumbled with her notepad, looking everywhere except at him. "What can I get you?" "Coffee to start," he replied, his voice steady low. He could tell she was holding back tears, and it made his chest tighten. He wasn't sure why it bothered him so much. Maybe it was her fragile composure. Maybe it was something else, but he couldn't ignore it. She nodded quickly and turned away, but not before he saw her swipe at her face with her sleeve. But he didn't look away. Something told him there was more to her story, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he wanted to know what it was. The waitress returned with his coffee, her hands trembling slightly. As she placed the cup in front of him, he noticed the faint smudges of ink on her fingers, the kind that came from scribbling notes in a hurry. Her eyes were red, barely holding back a flood of emotions. She clearly didn't want anyone to see. "Anything else?" she asked, her voice cracking just enough to betray her attempt at professionalism. He hesitated for a moment, then shook his head. "Just the coffee for now." She gave a quick nod, then turned to leave. But something about her movement seemed heavier, as if she carried a weight no one else could see. He watched her retreat behind the counter, where she leaned against the wall, staring blankly at the order slips pinned above the grill. She thought no one was watching, but he saw it all: the slight shudder of her shoulders, the quick dab at her eyes with the back of her hand. When she came back a few minutes later, he decided to speak. "Rough night?" he asked casually, trying to sound more conversational than intrusive. She froze for a moment, then offered a tight, forced smile. "Something like that." He could tell she wasn't used to anyone asking. Most people probably didn't notice or didn't care. "You seem tired," he said gently, his tone inviting rather than probing. Maybe more than tired. Her gaze dropped to the floor, and for a second he thought she might brush him off. Instead, she took a slow, shaky breath. "It's been a lot lately," she admitted quietly. "Too much, really." He nodded, letting her take her time. "You want to talk about it?" She blinked, her surprise almost palpable. "I know, it's fine," she stammered, though the crack in her voice said otherwise. "I shouldn't, I mean, you're just here for coffee sometimes," he said. "Talking helps, even to a stranger." Her lips pressed together, but then something in her seemed to soften. She glanced around the diner, ensuring no one was listening, and leaned slightly closer. "It's just," she began, struggling to find the words. "I'm working double shifts to keep things together. My daughter, she's 2, she needs so much, and her dad." She trailed off, shaking her head. "He's not in the picture anymore. I'm just trying to do it all, you know, but it feels like I'm failing." He listened intently, not interrupting, letting her spill the words that seemed to have been bottled up for far too long. But as she spoke, he felt something stirring inside him, a sense that this moment, small and fleeting, might hold more significance than either of them realized. She straightened quickly, As if embarrassed for saying too much. "Sorry," she mumbled. Stepping back, "I didn't mean to unload all that." "You don't need to hear it." He shook his head gently. "Don't apologize. Sometimes just saying it out loud can take the edge off." She smiled faintly, though her eyes remained distant. "Thanks," she said, her voice softer now, almost as if she didn't expect kindness from a stranger. I should get back to work," he nodded, watching as she disappeared behind the counter again. This time her movements seemed a little slower, like someone carrying the weight of invisible chains. As he sipped his coffee, he let his thoughts drift. Her story wasn't unique. He'd seen that kind of struggle in others before. But something about her raw honesty and the way she tried to hold herself together tugged at him. She was young, too young to feel so defeated. His mind wandered back to the years he'd spent clawing his way out of similar situations, working through nights, skipping meals, and relying on pure willpower to push forward. Life had never been easy. But he had learned that even the smallest acts of grace from others could make all the difference. The diner felt quieter now, the chatter fading into a dull background hum. He caught her glancing over once, and he offered her a small, reassuring smile. She quickly looked away, but not before he noticed a flicker of something. Maybe gratitude, maybe surprise. He finished his coffee, but didn't call for the check right away. Instead, he pulled a piece of paper from his pocket and a pen from the counter. He stared at the blank page for a moment, unsure how to start, but then the words began to flow. But this wasn't just about giving her comfort. It was about planting a seed, something she could hold on to. When the nights got even darker, the pen glided across the paper, his words forming with surprising ease. He didn't write anything elaborate, just a handful of sentences that came straight from the heart. They weren't about fixing her problems or offering empty platitudes. Instead, they spoke to resilience, to the quiet strength she already carried, but might not yet see in herself. He wrote about how even on the hardest days, showing up mattered, how the love she poured into her daughter was worth more than any paycheck, how he had seen her, really seen her, and believed she was doing better than she gave herself credit for. He folded the note carefully and tucked it under the edge of his empty coffee cup. For a moment he hesitated, wondering if this small gesture would even mean anything. But then he glanced back at her behind the counter, still moving like a ghost of herself, and knew it was worth a try. As he slid out of the booth, she noticed him and approached with the bill in hand. "I hope the coffee was okay," she said, her voice still faint but less shaky now. "It was just what I needed," he replied, holding her gaze for a moment. Before leaving the cash on the table, he motioned slightly toward the cup. "Take care of yourself," he added, his tone warm but firm, as if he were reminding her of something important. She furrowed her brow, glancing at the table. As he walked out the door, the folded note caught her eye, and she reached for it cautiously, her fingers trembling as they unfolded the paper. Her breath caught as she read the words. They weren't grand or poetic, but they hit her with the force of a wave. She read them again, tears pooling in her eyes. Not the kind born from frustration or exhaustion, but something gentler, something that soothed an ache she hadn't even known how to name. But as the door swung shut behind him, he couldn't have known how much those words would change, not just her, but the course of his own life. The note stayed with her long after her shift ended, when the diner finally emptied out and the fluorescent lights buzzed. In the silence, she sat alone in the corner booth, reading the words again. It wasn't just what he wrote. It was the fact that someone had seen her struggle and cared enough to say something. It was a reminder that she wasn't invisible. Even in the hardest moments, for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to breathe deeply. That night when she tucked her daughter into bed, she felt a glimmer of hope, like maybe things could get better. Maybe she wasn't failing after all. The next day, she came to work with a renewed sense of purpose. The weight on her shoulders hadn't disappeared, but it felt lighter somehow. She smiled more, even laughed with a few regulars. Her coworkers noticed too, exchanging curious glances, as if trying to figure out what had changed, but the impact didn't stop there. Weeks later, the man returned to the diner. He didn't plan on it, he simply happened to be in the area. And thought of the coffee. When he walked in, he barely recognized her. The young waitress was brighter now, standing taller, her movements more sure. "Hey," she greeted him, her voice steady this time. "Coffee again," he nodded, taking his usual seat. As she poured the steaming cup, she leaned in slightly and said, "I kept the note. I wanted you to know it made a difference." He smiled, surprised, but grateful. "I'm glad to hear that." Their conversation was brief, just a few words exchanged before she moved on to another table, but there was something unspoken in the air. A shared understanding that the small act had mattered, but as he sipped his coffee, he had no idea the note's journey wasn't over, it was only just beginning. Months passed and life went on for both of them. The man returned to his routines, focusing on his long shifts at the steel plant and quiet evenings at home. The memory of the waitress and the note occasionally crossed his mind, but he didn't dwell on it. For him, it had been a small gesture, something anyone could have done. But for her, the note had become a lifeline. It wasn't just a scrap of paper, it was a reminder of her strength. Inspired by those words, she started making small changes. She reached out to a local nonprofit that offered childcare support for single mothers. She enrolled in night classes at a community college, determined to build a future for herself and her daughter, and every time she doubted herself, she'd pull out the note and read it again. One evening as he returned home from work, the man found an envelope waiting in his mailbox. The return address was unfamiliar, and for a moment he assumed it was junk mail, but when he opened it, he froze. Inside was a handwritten letter from the waitress, thanking him again for his kindness. She shared how the note had changed her perspective and given her the push she needed to take control of her life. At the end of the letter was an invitation to attend the opening ceremony of a community center she had helped establish. It was a resource for struggling families, offering childcare, educational programs, and career counseling. "Your word started this," the letter read. "I hope you'll come see what they've done." He sat there holding the letter, his hands trembling slightly. It was hard to wrap his mind around it. His note, written in a moment of quiet empathy, had somehow sparked all this. But as he stared at the invitation, a question began to form in his mind. Could one small act really ripple out so far? He needed to see it for himself. The day of the ceremony arrived, and the man found himself standing outside the newly constructed community center. The building was modest but inviting, with a bright mural painted across one wall, depicting families of all backgrounds together in joy. A small crowd had gathered, chatting excitedly, as they waited for the ribbon cutting to begin. He hesitated before stepping closer. He wasn't sure why, but something about seeing this reality made him feel small in the best way possible. All he had done was write a note. Yet here he was standing in front of something tangible, something bigger than he could have imagined. The waitress, now radiating confidence, spotted him and broke into a smile. She hurried over, her hand outstretched. "You made it," she said, her voice brimming with gratitude. "I almost didn't believe it when I read your letter," he admitted, shaking her hand. "This place, it's incredible." "It's not just me," she said, quickly glancing around at the volunteers and staff. "A lot of people helped, but you were the one who started it. Your words reminded me that I wasn't alone, that I could do something for my daughter and others like us." As they talked, she shared the story of how the community had rallied behind her vision. Local businesses had donated supplies, and a few generous benefactors had provided funding. But what struck him the most was how she had become the driving force. Her passion and determination, infectious to everyone around her. The ceremony began shortly after, with speeches and applause echoing through the crowd. When she took the microphone, her voice carried a strength and assurance that hadn't been there months ago. She spoke about her journey, the struggles she had faced, and how a single moment of kindness had given her the courage to dream bigger. "I hope this center shows others what I've learned," she concluded, "that even in our hardest times, a small act can make all the difference." The man felt a lump form in his throat as the crowd erupted into applause. He wasn't someone who sought attention or praise. But in that moment, he realized how connected they all were. Strangers who in their own ways had shaped each other's lives. And as he left the ceremony, he couldn't help but wonder how many other lives could be touched by the ripples of small unseen acts of kindness. The man walked away from the ceremony, feeling a mix of emotions he hadn't anticipated. There was pride, sure, but also a deep sense of humility. He had done so little, yet it had grown into something extraordinary. It made him wonder about all the other moments in life when he had chosen to look away or hold back. What might have happened if he had stepped forward? Instead, the following weeks brought reflection. He shared the story with a close friend one evening, recounting how a simple note had led to the creation of a community center. His friend listened quietly, then said something that stuck with him. "You don't realize it, but you gave her something more than words. You gave her permission to hope." That thought stayed with him. He began to notice opportunities everywhere, chances to connect, to reach out, to be the voice of encouragement someone might need. And while he didn't write any more notes right away, his heart and mind were open in a way they hadn't been before. As for the community center, it thrived. He visited a few times, not to bask in recognition, but to volunteer quietly in the background. He'd help with small tasks, stacking chairs, organizing supplies. But each time he left, he felt lighter, knowing he was part of something that mattered. The waitress, now a community leader in her own right, always made time to say hello when he stopped by. They didn't talk about the note much anymore. They didn't need to. The impact was all around them. In the laughter of the children, the relief on parents' faces, and the hum of possibility that filled the air. And so the lesson remained: small gestures can lead to great change, but only if we choose to act. And perhaps the most important thing we can ever do is let someone know they're not alone. If this story moved you, think about the small ways you can make a difference in someone's life. Share a kind word, lend a helping hand, or simply let someone know you see them. Together, these moments can spark a chain reaction of hope and change. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us of the power we all hold to make a difference. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. For more content, please leave your comments and share your experiences. Thank you for being part of Gill Master Stories community. See you soon.